Hey there, John McWhorter. How you doing?
Hey, Glenn Loury. How are you doing?
It is springtime. I mean, I can't tell you how good that feels to me. It's a beautiful day here in sunny Providence, Rhode Island. Commencement will occur on Sunday, and that's a joyous occasion. There's a lot of bustle, but my spirits are up. This is a great day today.
That must be beautiful. I was in Providence recently, and I was profoundly impressed by what a nice place it's become.
It's a nice town. I think underrated. Yeah, I'm sorry I missed you. I knew you were here. I was out of town when you visited, but yeah.
Yeah, Providence is especially nice lately. Here in Jersey City, it's spring too, and it is interfering with my respiratory system.
Oh,
but
sorry
it is
about
nice
that.
to see. And so, yeah, things are definitely nice. And I don't have a graduation to enjoy, but I have seen people on the streets in their caps and gowns, and I still have a sort of biological sense that this time of year is the end of a certain period, even though I'm not at a university. So, yeah, I know where you're coming from.
Well, you know, there's a lot wrong in the ivory tower, as many would be quick to point out. But one of the things that's right over here is this annual ritual of matriculation and you know, commencement. It's pretty special. You see the parents, and you know, there's an acknowledgement of accomplishment. There's a sense of you know, the shifting of generations and so on, and it's just a great thing.
And it's what the parents paid for, and they get to concretely see.
And they paid. I can tell you, as a parent with one and soon to be two college going, I'm waiting for one of these Democrats to get elected and bail me out, you know.
It's scary, isn't it?
Some more welfare states, so help to pay for college, because it's taking a real hit.
When I was a lad, I remember $10,000 for college was considered a lot.
Yeah, well, you know, the number is like 50 now.
I can't believe so many people do
50 per kid per year.
Oh, that's frightening. That is utterly frightening. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to have to come up with something. But, yeah, so I sympathize. I very much
Well, you've got to do it by keep writing best-selling books and, you know, continue to add to that larder that you've been stocking up.
You know, the sad thing, though, is that I'm too weird to ever write a real bestseller. You know, a couple of my books, Losing the Race and Power of Babel, have done pretty well, but even then, only pretty well. And it's interesting, I can't think of anything I would write about where everybody would really eat it up. Like, I'd have to write some silly red meat book that I didn't really believe in order for it to help put my future children through college. And I don't think I could do that. Maybe I need to write novels. You know, people seem to like reading stories.
Well, warning, what I hear is that's a bottomless pit. You enter in and you may never come out again.
Yeah, I know.
Writing novels is a lot harder than it looks. At least writing decent novels, I think.
Yeah, it would be utterly hopeless. What about Brown, Glenn? I mean, what about one or both of your kids going? Isn't there some sort of arrangement?
Well, no. What Brown does is they give the faculty a small stipend to help to defray college expenses, about 15 or 20% of the actual out-of-pocket monies. Per year. You get that as a kind of benefit. That's a cash benefit that you get no matter where your kid goes to school, whether it's Brown or any place else. If your kid is good enough and fortunate enough to get admitted to Brown, then as a faculty member you have the opportunity to fork over the same $50K that you can fork over at any place else. So,
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, well, that's the way it goes. But I want to ask you. It just occurred to me something about your fellow linguist, Steven Pinker, who has a piece in the current New Republic called "The Stupidity of Dignity." Have you seen it?
I must admit I don't read the New Republic anymore, and so no, I haven't seen that.
Whoa! Wait, now we have hit upon an even more interesting topic of discussion. Forget the linguist Steven Pinker, since you haven't seen the piece. The piece is interesting. He's attacking the President's Bioethics Commission's report, which has said these new technologies, you know, manipulating genetic material and, you know, stem cell research is one instance, but it's a lot of other stuff. That report raises ethical questions about the extent to which that kind of scientific research might be a threat to human dignity, and attempts to put down some guidelines to constrain it. And Steve Pinker attacks this whole project as being wrong-headed. What is human dignity anyway, he says. And he says it's a kind of anti-progressive reflex that you've seen time and again, largely from a religiously inspired corner of society where they try to say scientific progress is a threat to some transcendent, humane norm, and what they end up doing is just holding back progress. But I'd much rather know how it is that you don't read the New Republic anymore. How's that? You have to write a column.
Yeah.
This is one of the leading political magazines. Aren't you a contributing editor at the New Republic?
Well, theoretically. You know, Glenn, as you well know, it's at the point where people who do the sorts of things that we do are deluged with so much to read. I mean, newspapers get thicker, and then there's this online business. There are all these blogs and sites to read in order to not be caught short. And so you have to pick and choose.
Yeah.
And I read a lot of magazines, and I have always admired the New Republic. I actually kind of cut my teeth on the New Republic.
Yeah.
But even though I think I'm still in the masthead, I have not written a piece for the print New Republic since 2003, and so I'm not really part of the magazine.
Oh, I see.
And in terms of picking and choosing, you know, my column is for the New York Sun. I've just kind of let it go by the wayside because one cannot do everything. I read some articles in it, but I don't subscribe.
Oh, but it's not a principle, though. I don't read the New Republic anymore because they're too left or right. Or
No, their politics have, about 85% always been mine. I kind of learned to write from them, starting to read them when I was in graduate school. So, yeah, great admirer, but, there are too many things to read at this point. And, to tell you the truth, I also think that with great admiration of the magazine, they are declining in influence. I mean, 10 years ago, I think they were more of a player than they are now, and that has influenced my decision as to what to sit down with. Now it'll be every 2 weeks instead of every 1 week. But yeah, great admirer, and I have written, I've written for their blog over the past couple of years. I wrote one piece on Obama for them. Do you read them every 2 weeks?
No, what happens is in my email inbox, I get a bulletin every day, it seems like.
TNR Politics, right.
Telling me, what's going on in politics, what's going on in the culture section of the magazine. Mm-hmm. And I usually let my eye roll over that list of stuff, and I'll click on something if it looks interesting enough to me. And if the content is online, I may skim it, I may read it, depending on how interesting. If the content is, subscriber only in the magazine, I don't subscribe to the magazine anymore. So, and as you say, time is limited, so I usually let those go.
And that's another problem, the subscriber-only part. I understand why they do it, but it does mean that is one more decision that weights them out in terms of what I'm gonna put my eyes over. But yeah, they're a good bunch, and I very much wish them well.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as the Steve Pinker ethics question, I can pretend to have read that piece, and I think, of course, he is absolutely right. My feeling is that the sorts of guidelines that are being suggested in terms of what's being called human dignity are ones which I think also must be based, at least partly, in, I don't want to say in ignorance about how science works and how cells work and things like that, because ignorant is such a pejorative word. It's like throwing a ball of mud at somebody. But I wonder how acquainted people like this are with what the actual physiological and histological mechanisms are that we're dealing with. And I also wonder if they're familiar with these things, whether they realize that we're talking about alleviating human suffering and whether that means anything to them when they assign their priorities. And so I admire Steve Pinker for being the ardent secularist that he always is without being a bully about it. And yeah, I would be on his side. Dignity in this case is a word being wielded to turn our head away from some more concrete realities that have to do with people dying unnecessarily. It will look like it's unnecessary many years from now. And so I would have to go with Steve on that one.
Well, yeah, that is his argument. His argument is think of what increments to to the relief of human suffering, the extension of life, the improvement of the quality of life are potentially available through various technologies, and that ought to factor in whatever your notion of human dignity is. And says Pinker, you haven't been very clear about it, says he to the President's Advisory Council. Whatever that notion might be, it ought to include the benefits associated with expanding human knowledge and being able to relieve people's suffering and so forth. The people that we're talking about here, some of them on this commission, I don't know the whole roster, but people like Leon Cass, the ethicist at the University of Chicago, Robert George, who's a political philosopher at Princeton.
That's right.
I think Michael Sandel, the political philosopher at Harvard, has been involved with that group.
I would assume, right.
In any case, I'm saying these are not lightweights. These are, these are very serious. They're not scientists, but they're very reflective and thoughtful people.
You know what interests me in cases like this is just that human cognition seems to have trouble dealing with the nature of continua. And so the issue of when life begins is one of those where there's no dividing line to be made. And it seems to me that if you genuinely understand how human beings are conceived and what the process entails, you realize that the notion of life beginning at any particular point doesn't really have any logical basis, but humans have a hard time thinking that way. It's just like the Ebonics controversy way back, and there are a bunch of people who were saying that Black English is a different language than English, and black students need to be transitioned into standard English by using their native dialect as a bridge. And they said, for example, look at what happens in the Caribbean, where students speaking Jamaican patois have trouble learning standard English. Now, one can say the difference is that Black English is not as unlike standard English as Jamaican patois. Jamaican patois is more of a different language than Black English. I've noticed that a lot of people just can't go with me there. They don't see it as, and they can't see that there is a continuum issue and it's hard to draw lines. And it's not just that if one dialect is different, then they're all different to the same degree and the same policies apply to them. It's just human cognition. I imagine I probably make the same mistake in looking at other things that I have less interest in.
Yeah,
but in terms of the dignity issue, it's one of those.
The tendency is to want to have a bright distinction, either or, A or B, a black or white kind of thing.
That's the way we look at things naturally. And one of the highest aspects, I think, of being a quote-unquote educated person, like what one has to be led out of by going to school and reading, is the notion that everything is either or so to speak, in terms of what we often talk about, black and white, that life is continua and that we have to grapple with that all the time. But I wonder if the dignity people completely understand that.
Well, that's certainly a point, but something else that occurs to me is that we do have taboos, and we attach significance to things that are not entirely rational. I mean, for example, we don't allow the sale of, we prohibit the sale of body parts. This kind of trafficking in kidneys and such. And, there's there are a lot of reasons why. I mean, and you can point to the possibilities of exploitation, the idea that, desperate people will be, if there's a market in these things and maybe the consumers won't be well protected, all these kind of things about how the market might break down. But I think there's also a moral thing in it, that we think there's something, sacred, or there's a special reverence about the human body. You can cut your hair off and you can sell it. Nobody asks a question. But if you want to cut out a kidney and sell it, everybody says, or a lot of people say, no, no, no. Or we will go retrieve bodies fallen on a battlefield, even when it means more bodies are going to be lost. We'll go, save people in a fire or in a mudslide, even when we know that we put the rescue crews at grave risk and the rational decision might be to leave them there. You know what I mean? So I wonder if one can just dismiss out of hand this notion that there are extra rational, almost, mystical or quasi-religious, certainly spiritual aspects to human existence that we, should constrain the way we apply our science and, this kind of thing.
Oh, yeah, and I think that there will be cases like that. Once again, where do you draw the line? And we have to decide through processes, passive and active, where that line will be. But we have to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. And on the one hand, of course, we will go to a battlefield and retrieve a body. That's probably innate in us. Arguments against doing that would seem rather clinical to all of us for various reasons. But when it comes to the issue of how we're going to treat how we're going to treat fetuses and how we're going to treat little balls of cells, I think we have a case where we can perhaps examine, from the point of view of what we understand now of science, the taboos that would have made sense to a medieval person or even someone 150 years ago. It's a rehearsal, this thing called humanity now. I think that's one scene where we could do some revisions. Yeah. But your point is well taken.
But shouldn't we be talking about politics? Neither one of us is much of...
that's what we're...
We got this presidential election thing going. Looks like my candidate is going down to defeat, and I'm in mourning.
I'm sorry.
I don't know, stage 2. I'm pretty early on in the process.
No, I'm sorry. I feel you. I can put myself in your head. It's a shame, but it sees like the die is cast. And
it's not over till the lady in the pantsuit does something, I've been told.
Well, as you know, it might not be over. I mean, the official talk over the past 48 hours is that she just might settle for being on board in some non-presidential position. How would you feel about that?
I guess I don't think it's going to happen.
Clinton, the Veep.
But, what do I know? How would I feel about it? I guess I'd feel that I would get into trouble with people if I say this, but here goes. I'd feel that the person most qualified to be president of the United States was in the number 2 spot on the ticket. But that's part of me not having completed the mourning process yet, and not having fully accepted my loss and all of that. So I'm still kicking and screaming over here. I'm still fighting against the inevitable tide. So how would I feel about it? I think it's probably something that's 1/3 chance of happening, because there's a certain political logic in it. But that's not what I want. I want Hillary.
Well, you know something? I know where you're coming from, but I am very excited because we're about to, and there's a specific reason. We're about to go to a new phase in this thing. And Obama is clearly, I think he's going to be the nominee most likely, and then he's going to go up against McCain. And America is going to learn yet another lesson. I am so enjoying watching America, white and black, learning certain lessons about where we are on race versus where we're often told that we are. So the first lesson, there have been 3 main ones. First lesson was in Iowa, where we saw that all of these white people actually were more interested in him than in the white lady. Now, before that, everybody really found that hard to imagine. Barack Obama's just going to be the black candidate, and then a few people who go to Starbucks are going to like him who are white. And that was disproven, and nobody quite knew what to do with it. Then, second lesson, New Hampshire didn't work out so well for him, and people were just poised. They had their pens above the paper, ready to write that it was the Bradley effect and that white people had lied at the polls. That turned out not to be true. You still see it sometimes now from lesser informed people who just want to say that the Bradley effect has had some sort of effect on Obama, but no, the Bradley effect is gone. So we've learned that lesson. That's going to completely seep in. And now here's number 3. The new fashionable thing is to suppose that just because you have, say, uneducated, often older white people in places like West Virginia saying that they won't vote for Obama because he's black. And the whole issue of what that means because he's black and whether that means that they are racist is a rich one in itself. But just because there are people who say that, and big surprise, you can find those people. Why would there not be such people? The idea is that there are going to be enough of those people to make John McCain president. And I will predict right now, and it'll be online, this is Blogging Heads, and so I'll have egg on my face.
Predict the result of the election?
I will predict that those people will not be something that gets John McCain elected. Now, I'm not going to say that I can say definitely that Barack Obama will win, but it will not. It will be demonstrable that it is not those racists, that those racists are not as numerous as the kinds of white people who have advanced beyond that. And I want to see that lesson learned, because once it's learned, there is so much chaff that will be cleared out in terms of how we talk about black people, racism, and elections. It will make for a much more fruitful and progressive dialogue about where we've come at this point.
Yeah, I wonder if the throngs of black people who are voting for Barack Obama have any idea that they're voting for this transformation of the significance and understandings about race that you just got through enumerating.
I doubt it.
I seriously doubt it. I mean, in a way, you're talking about the end of race as we know it.
Yep. I mean, to over-dramatize it, it's not going to be a
new day. Race over. Yes. Orlando Patterson, a sociologist friend of mine.
And Aaron Copland music on the soundtrack? Yeah, a brand new day. That is what I'm thinking about. This is very
we're going to get some musical theater in here, too. Huh?
But yeah, Orlando Patterson's idea, it's really important. If this doesn't happen, I'm going to be the one who's going through the mourning. If in November it turns out that old white man is president, I don't quite know what I'm going to do with myself. Yeah. That all of this was for nothing, because I am really excited about this. You aren't, apparently, about that, but I am.
Well, I shudder for my country a little bit as I anticipate this campaign, because I think it's going to get ugly. I do, and I'm not blaming anybody for that, although there will be plenty of blame passed around. But you must have heard just the other day John McCain firing back at Obama, who had criticized McCain's position on this GI Bill of Rights legislation.
Yeah.
McCain's not supporting it because he's got a fiscally more responsible, close quote, version. Now, I'm not taking a position one way or the other on the legislation. Mm-hmm. But McCain's comment was, in effect, who the heck is Barack Obama, who never served this country and basically is still wet behind the ears, to have an opinion about what we ought to be doing with our veterans? And how dare he criticize me about our veterans, said McCain.
Mm-hmm. Well, he has a right to say that.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying he shouldn't have said it or whatever. I'm just saying the tone of it was pretty hard. And I think we know by now that Obama is capable of giving as good as he gets on this front.
Yeah,
he's capable of being derisive, contemptuous. Mm-hmm. George Bush and John McCain have a lot to answer for. He says. Yeah. So, and what with these subterranean things going on, the racial stuff, the Reverend Wright stuff, whatever, I wonder if they're going to be able to keep the gloves on. And, not everybody's under control. These 527s, these independent organizations that can run television advertisements and such. Mm-hmm. I worry that it could get quite ugly before the day is done. And, your happy scenario where your candidate prevails and America learns all these lessons is just one scenario. There's another one where the deepening divisions are entrenched, the anger and the bitterness is exacerbated, and the country is even more divided at the end of the thing.
Well, something. Of course, I don't know whether we can draw a line between happy after November and bitterness before, but I genuinely don't understand sometimes what would be so bad about a mano-a-mano fight between those two men. And I think maybe this is partly because my parents did not like each other very much, and so I grew up watching a lot of fighting. So there's some of my psychobiography. So, for example, watching Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf to me is always slightly familiar.
Oh, my God.
And almost cozy. I'm used to that. Fighting is what I watched, and I learned how to do it.
It was an interesting childhood, huh, Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't exactly like that. But, sharp words and verbal battle, to me, that's mother's milk. And as a result, I don't cringe when I see people exchanging sharp words, especially in these times when there do seem to be some issues. We've got this war, the economy is tanking in a serious way. These are times. And so shouldn't people... Isn't rhetorical skill and having controlled dashes of emotion part of actually getting through things? How polite do we really want to be? And it seems to me, and you're not one of these people, I don't think, but I don't like the fact that a lot of people seem to think that because Barack Obama is black, and maybe skinny and young and has a charming smile, that somehow it's not right to beat up on him, as if somehow he's this deer caught in the headlights. He can take it. If there's a such thing as black strength, then let's watch him fight back. And maybe it's not as charming as watching him getting up and talking about hope, etc. But in these times, we need somebody who can take it, who can close the deal, so to speak. Is it really just that I am so confrontational a person that I'm missing something about human nature that somehow I should cringe to watch people being beat up upon? Because frankly, I don't. That's what life is.
I think you're making an interesting point. Equality is equality. George Will had a column a couple of weeks ago or a week ago or so to the effect that one of the things that gender equality means is that women have a right to want, run, and lose. So if Hillary Clinton gets defeated, that's entirely consistent with a conception of a much more open system for women. It's not only must she prevail, she can also lose, right? Men lose every day, and that's part of the deal. And likewise with Obama, I think he seems strongest when he is pushing against this Obambi narrative, when he's slugging back. And I think he has been protected a little bit by this kid glove stuff. For example, if you question his competency, if you say, "Hey, this guy, where'd he come from? He never did anything. He's never run anything." Many people's response is, "What? Are you saying a black man is not competent to be president of the United States?"
Exactly.
And to which the answer could be, sure. You remember Dan Quayle? In other words, it's perfectly fine to say the guy's not competent. Let him come back and tell me why he is, or you come back.
Right.
Don't presume that I can't criticize him because somehow he's to criticize him is to disrespect the people who support him. Make an argument. He's fully capable of making arguments. I think he shows it.
That's a mental habit, I think, of supposing that blackness alone is an argument. I think that's a hangover from 40 and 45 years ago. And I think that this whole campaign is showing how frayed that is. The color of his skin and the history of his people, or you might say our people and the people who he has embraced, is not an argument. And the shorthand that I think a lot of people are expecting to be generally understood isn't working anymore.
Well, quiet is kept, John. It's never been a good argument. It was sometimes a successful argument because, people would just shut up. They wouldn't come back at you because they didn't want to offend, but it was never a very strong argument.
Right, in the days of Maude and TV shows like that. Yeah, that era is over.
But one of the problems with arguing and fighting, especially between Obama and McCain and coming into this campaign, is that it encourages their supporters to see themselves as on opposite sides of something. Do we really want an election in which it's, the unenlightened, the benighted whites against everybody else? In which the talking heads on TV, on the cable channels, and the editorialists at the Post and the Times and elsewhere, and the kind of elite commentariat are all lined up behind this idea that America stands on the threshold of doing something important and so forth. And then the African Americans and the liberals and the youthful enthusiasts and so forth over and against some kind of
Me too.
over and against some kind of backward, racist, not particularly well-educated...
beer bottle people.
Yeah, right? Beer bottle types and the, West Virginias and the Kentuckys of the country and so forth. Doesn't that have the potential of getting into being a really kind of ugly division? Yeah, between people if it's not well managed?
Yeah, and this is more of the happy day coming up, because I think all evidence is that we're going to see when it's over, and boy will it be fun when it's over and we can really just look at all this as data instead of speculating. We're going to see that as many, if not more, of the beer bottle people went for Obama as didn't. And so many of them...
think so?
Oh yeah, many of them who preferred Clinton are not going to then go hopping over to McCain. No poll has shown that that's going to be anything like a majority phenomenon. So they don't get Hillary, and therefore they're going to vote Republican. I think people's party loyalties generally are firmer than that. And so Obama is going to get lots of votes from that crowd. And it's interesting because there seems to be this tacit idea that if the college-educated, brie-eating blue American has not been for Obama, then it's because they have an intelligent, principled interest in Hillary Clinton, such as your own. But if the beer bottle person decides that they like Hillary Clinton better, it's because they're tribalists who are more comfortable with their own and or they're outright racist. And I think that really undersells and underestimates working class white people who don't have college educations. I think there's a bit of snobbery in that assumption. And I think we're going to see that it's simply inaccurate. And I want to add something else, which is that during this time, the very definition of what racism is beginning to kind of implode because, the reporters are running around desperately looking for people chewing on tobacco saying that they're not going to vote for that darky. And what it seems to me that they find again and again is that for every person who comes right out and says something like this, and they are almost always 700 years old, then they find a bunch of other people who say, I won't vote for a black person because he's the radical type who might bring in Farrakhan, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's not true, but that really, in a principled sense, is not I don't like black people. It's there are certain black people who've done certain things, and quote unquote he's a Muslim, and therefore that's not to me racism. That's a kind of ignorance. That's a kind of a grand view of history that doesn't take detail into account. But that person doesn't hate black people, and you find more comments like that, which mean that we're talking about whether race matters rather than whether racism matters. And we're going to see that racism just doesn't play as much of a role in this as a lot of people seem to want it to. I think for the dramatic thrill of it and to reaffirm their own good bona fides as good people, they want racism to play a role. And
no, I think you're right. The racism explanation is much too simplistic. It doesn't cut deeply enough. I mean, it merely invites the question, what do you mean when you say that? And ultimately, I think what people will be meaning is something like what you said, which is that it's race, not racism. That is to say, it is that the foreignness of the guy, his unfamiliarity, the sort of stereotypes that may hover around, the beliefs that people have, or the suspicions that they have, leads them to form a judgment, but it's not some implacable antipathy to the very idea that a black man might be president of the United States.
Right.
But you know, what was it? I mean, 2-1 in West Virginia and Kentucky, Clinton over Obama. So if it's not racism, and if it's just a racial, a racially influenced judgment that people are making, an awful lot of them are making it against Obama. What makes you think they're going to change their mind so readily in the general election?
Well, because their liking Hillary Clinton might partly be due to a kind of birds of a feather phenomenon, more comfortable with the white candidate. But she's also a Democrat, and people's party affiliations are rather like their social affiliations. And the idea that that same sense of a white person is familiar would make them vote for somebody who is widely seen more and more as somebody who's going to continue what went on under the most accursed administration in the 20th and 21st centuries, other than Warren Harding's. I think that is a real question. Once there's no Hillary, are they going to go vote for the Republican and one who's so reviled in many ways just because they have such a discomfort with the Negro? And I think that it's at the point where people like that are increasingly old, and that it's not even demonstrably a majority among the old. Birds of a feather is interesting because we think of the black person who moves to a new town, and immediately they start looking for ways of interacting socially with people of color, as it's often put. And there's a certain kind of thoroughly intelligent, cosmopolitan black person who is given to saying that they're not really comfortable unless they're around black people, that the white world is sort of a second language. And we see that as diversity, we see that as a kind of a healthy social identification. But then if there's a white person who feels the same way, they're most comfortable around other working class white people without college educations who like to do the things they do and talk the way they talk. Well, then we assume that there must be some racial component. And so white people aren't allowed to be diverse. And of course, the quick defense of this would be that black people feel more comfortable with each other because they feel threatened by white people. But I don't think that's necessarily it. There is a culture. There is a culture within the culture, which is black culture, and people enjoy doing it together.
Well, of course they can. I mean, you're making such an interesting point. I mean, I'm thinking about this gay marriage decision in the California courts that just came down, and so the argument has been quickened once again about the legitimacy of gay marriage and all of that. And I'm thinking, many progressive people will say, look, people have a right to have a way of life and so on. So, and this happens to be about sexuality, and, they should be not discriminated against because of it. Well, there are many aspects to a way of life and to how a way of life is perceived and constructed. And the role that race might play in that, I think it's quite interesting. So for blacks, I speak as a black man, race is a central aspect of my being, come what may, like it or not. It's part of my identity package, part of the way I see the world and so on. Am I willing to grant that that some whites might have their race, I use the word with inverted commas, also to be a constituent aspect of how they understand themselves? I mean, my instinct is to be suspicious of that, because that's the thing that leads to kind of racial nationalism, a kind of whiteness mentality that can be oppressive for the minority. Right. But how can you have the blackness genie out of the bottle? You know what I mean? People going around calculating, conceiving, describing, and being motivated in part by notions about blackness in politics, as is the case now with the Obama candidacy, and not have the whiteness genie out of the bottle. I mean, you know, when Jesse Jackson ran for president, and a lot of blacks voted for him, because he was never a serious candidate, it didn't really raise the question of whiteness in anybody's mind. But now that Barack Obama, a black man, solid black support, but a lot of support beyond it, is running and defeating the leading candidate, a lot of white voters are, I think now, some of them in these places that we've been talking about, confronted with the question of whiteness. And for me, then, the question arises, is that okay? Can they think about themselves as white? Or how can I have it that some people can think of themselves as black, but have it at the same time be illegitimate that other people can think of themselves as white? It seems quite a problem to me.
Isn't that interesting? I mean, I think that we have to consider, here's one possible future in America, which is that we've gotten past race, and there are white people who are, you know, I'm going to come up with a stereotype. They're drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon, and they're playing bingo, and they live in Appalachia, and they're hanging out with each other. And that's what they do. And
they listen to country music, too.
Right, they listen to that sort of music. And they don't have any problem with black people, but they just don't know many, and nor do they seek them out, because they are just not of that group. And then they're black people doing what black people do, and they are not afraid of the white people. So the idea is that our racial identity is not a defensive crouch. It is not a kind of 12-step program. It's just people doing what they do. And that's all okay. That strikes me as better than the vision that some people seem to have, which is that as long as there is a separate white identity, then black people have to be a little bit uncomfortable that white people hanging out together is always set to lead to some sort of revivification of the past, or David Duke, or white nationalists. And of course there are going to be white nationalists, but the issue is whether there are enough of them to matter. There are typewriters around. I don't think that they're threatening Microsoft. And we have a lot of questions about that. Where are we going to go when we get past race? And for me, I don't know. I think part of the reason that I'm considered controversial is that I'm really not afraid of white people. They don't make me uncomfortable. I never thought they were smarter than me. When I was little, I was 4 years old, getting in trouble in school because I was telling my white teachers that I knew more than them. Not black teachers, the white ones. That felt natural to me. There's something wrong with me. And so my feeling is that I think about a woman in a flowered shirt playing bingo and drinking Pabst Blue Ribbon in West Virginia, and I'm not worried about her, and my first impulse is not to think that she's a racist. She's just that woman, and she's living her life. I think a lot of people look at her and immediately their antennas go up. I miss that, and I'm not sure that I'm missing that because I'm wrong. I think that there's a habit of mind that some people might consider getting out of.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, John.
Are you afraid of them, Glenn?
Afraid of whites?
Do you look at white people and kind of wonder whether they think that you're as smart as them and all these things?
Well, John, I'm almost 60 years old here. I mean, I was probably once afraid of white people when I first came out of Chicago and went to MIT as a graduate student way back in the early 1970s. I didn't know if I'd measure up, and I wondered how I'd fit in, and I didn't, which fork do I use when there are all these forks and all this kind of stuff. If the wine's not sweet, how do I know this?
Yeah.
I mean, really. But that was, 35 years ago, and I've since grown out of it,
I know how that is, actually. Yeah, but would you say, and I don't mean to pry, but it's interesting to me because of the time period that you straddle that I missed. Do you grow out of it? Or is it something that is always stamped with you because that's what you knew? You knew Jim Crow. I completely missed that. And I don't know, maybe it imprints a person forever, maybe it doesn't.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for the whole generation of people. What I know is that when I got out of the south side of Chicago and had the whole wide world open to me, I heard opera. You know what I mean? I traveled to the Middle East. I traveled to Northern Europe, and by the time I was 30 years old, I had in the last 5 years of my life completely different experiences than in the previous 25 years of my life. It was a tremendously liberating thing. And I swore to myself that if I had children, I would never allow them to be so, confined and to have such a parochial kind of constraint put on their view of the world. The world's a big, broad place. you know? And I thought, and Stanley Crouch,
well, yeah.
Do you know Stanley Crouch? Yeah, Stanley has written about this, I think, quite brilliantly. You know, the world's a big, wide place, and sort of getting out of the village and getting into the cosmopolis, you know, getting into the center of civilization and seeing what's going on. This is something that everybody has to do. You have to do it if you were born in a small town in Kansas, if you were born in the West Virginia mountains. You have to do it if you're a working class, if you're an ethnic, if you're a Catholic, if you're a Jew. And it's not any different for blacks in that regard. Well, maybe it's a little different. Maybe it's harder in some respects. But still, the same challenge of sort of looking beyond the limited horizons and seeing what the big whole world is about and then finding one's place in it and so on. This is a great liberating thing. And, you know, no looking back. As far as I'm concerned, once the shade is pulled up and you can see out the window,
and, you know, it's interesting
there's no
you bring
looking
up
back.
Stanley. Because I think a lot of people would listen to what you said and think, but if you're kind of looking out and you're going and seeing a performance of Peter Grimes and you like Elvis Costello and you're black, then you might be losing your identity. And no one would say that about Stanley. You know, Stanley is a very cosmopolitan man, but that is somebody who is certainly authentically black. And I don't think it's just because he's of your generation. You can be a Stanley who is 40. I've known Stanleys who are 40. Branford Marsalis is someone who's like that also, who I've met. You know, authentically black, but, you know, interested in the wider world. And it's interesting you bring that up because I myself am finding, you know, as Mr. Race Pundit, that I want to do this. I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, but I'm beginning to miss the wider world in a way. And I've actually realized that to actually be true to what I am, I can't only be doing this. I've still been doing my linguistics on the side, but in terms of what I'm doing on an everyday basis, I think I'm about to start teaching the core course at Columbia. So Plato and Freud and stuff. And that has nothing to do with anything I've ever done before. But I can learn, I'm going to be teaching Freud to people at a seminar because I need the wider world again. You know, I think that there is a Du Bois reading at the end of it. That's fine. But most of it is just about universal themes. And I kind of feel like one is responsible for that if one is a minority who has had opportunities to look out and then pass that on to one's kids. Definitely.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, but what a brave thing to do. Columbia University, so, you know, these students are going to be as smart as they get. And you're going to stand up in front of them with the great text of modern, social science. I mean, Freud. Do you get a little Marx in there? I mean, I'm just wondering what the reading list looks like.
There is Marx, of course, and there is Kant, and there is Hegel, and they actually have to read long stretches, generally entire books in this case, St. Augustine. And apparently the students actually do the reading. I asked about that. Am I going to end up in front of a class where you can tell nobody's done the reading? And I dealt with students of that caliber when I taught for a year at Cornell. Many Berkeley students were of that caliber, but of course it was less uniform. And it's going to be work. It's going to be grading papers, but I want to put my head in a realm wider. I think it's Obama that's done it to me, because Obama has been kind of good for all of us in a way. But it means day after day after day, you're thinking about that one guy and these 2 or 3 issues that keep coming up. And I must admit, I am beginning to feel it's becoming a bit one note, and I'm beginning to miss the rest of the world. And so I'm going to do something about it.
Good for you, John.
Definitely.
That's great, and good for those students. You know, my son Nehemiah, who's a junior in high school, we've been going around the colleges, and we spent an afternoon over at Columbia in Morningside Heights. They talked about the core curriculum. I found it a very attractive thing that the freshmen would be taking a lot of their classes all together on all of this, Homer and all this kind of stuff. But I never imagined that, adjunct professors who'd be teaching in the core curriculum would be of the caliber, if I may say so, of yourself. That's pretty cool.
Very sweet. But and thank you. But actually, there are various quote unquote caliber people who do it. Apparently, it's something that a lot of people are doing for reasons rather similar to mine, wanting to immerse themselves in these ideas and to share them. So people who you kind of wouldn't expect who are working at a certain high level in other places. And apparently it really is something, this having a real core curriculum that students actually all have to take. My wife has a BA from Columbia, and she went through all this, and she said that it means that people can make jokes about Boccaccio in door messages or in group emails because, for better or for worse, everybody had to read Boccaccio. And so that's what I call college. I mean, that's something real. And you can feel it. Because of my wife, I know quite a few Columbia graduates, and yeah, they did all read Boccaccio. And you don't retain every word, of course, but I would definitely like to be part of that. Rather than teaching linguistics, actually teaching people about Dante and Boccaccio. So yes, I look forward to that. Still going to be doing the race stuff, still going to be doing Blogging Heads with you, but instead of what are you doing, John? Oh, I'm writing a column, it'll be, oh, I'm writing a column, and I'm reading 22 papers on what students thought about Dante. So we shall see. It's going to be an adventure.
That's the best. I taught in the core curriculum in Boston University when I was there.
Oh, really?
For a few years, off and on over the years.
Hard
I
work.
did social science courses, but we tried to read, classic works, of the 19th and 20th century, about urbanization and modernization and globalization and all these sort of large forces, but
Right.
very thoughtful and foundational works, and it was a tremendous experience to do that.
Yeah, and a lot of work, I'll bet. But
Oh yeah, it's keeping up with the reading and reading all these students' papers, and also it's it not being in your specialty.
Exactly.
You can't just come in and lecture off the cuff.
Not
you
all
have to
in
think
your
very
head.
carefully.
Right.
And these young minds coming to this material for the first time, and all the kinds of questions that come up that lead to such interesting discussions. It's very good.
I am definitely looking forward to it. But we will keep doing this. This is all very important. But yeah, all of us must branch out. I see you already did, and so yeah, I will follow in your footsteps as I often have. Yeah. So
Okay. So what, have we shot our wad here today?
I think the wad has been shot. I want to wait and see what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks with what and everything else.
Why don't we make a date to come back after, what was it, June 3rd or something like that?
Why don't we do June 4th?
The dust will have settled.
That's right. Yeah.
Sounds good to me, John. Always good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you too, Glenn, and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Take care now.
You too.
Bye.